Good evening and welcome everyone to Mount Washington Observatory's Science in the Mountains program. My name is Brian Fitzgerald and I am the Director of Education for Mount Washington Observatory. And joining us this evening to help us explore projections for extreme precipitation across the northeastern United States is Fairfield University Associate Professor Rob Nazarian. All right, thanks so much for joining for tonight's program. For those of you who are not already familiar, Mount Washington Observatory is a nonprofit member-supported organization with a mission to advance the understanding of the forces that create Earth's weather and climate. And the way that we accomplish that is through operating our Summit Weather Station with around-the-clock weather observation and forecasting, by conducting research and product testing, and by developing and offering innovative educational programs. If you have questions for tonight's speaker and you're joining over Zoom, please make sure you use the Q&A button. You can find that at the bottom of your toolbar there on your video screen. We are able to collect some questions throughout the program, so make sure get them in whenever you have them. If you're joining on the live stream on Facebook, welcome. Thanks so much for joining that way. We won't be able to get to your live questions during the program, but we'll make sure to follow up after the fact and respond as quickly as we can. If you'd like to connect through Zoom for a next program, make sure you register over at mountwashington.org over at the Science of the Mountains tab for our next program. And apologies this evening, I am traveling, so if my internet is a little slow this evening, hopefully it's not too much of an issue, but thanks for bearing with me. We'd love to get everyone into the mix for the program this evening and introduce our speaker. But before we do that, I'll go ahead and launch just a quick poll for those of you who are joining over Zoom. We have 3 questions for you this evening. One, we're curious, and if you're on Zoom, you'll see these questions popping up in front of you. The first one, just curious, where are you joining from tonight? Could be a state within New England, could be outside of New England, or it could be outside the US of A. A couple questions from our speaker, Rob, this evening. First one being, how do scientists quantify extreme precipitation? Is it a 1 in 10-year storm? Days with precipitation exceeding 10 millimeters? Is it consecutive days of rain, or is it all the above? And then the last question here, where in the northeastern United States experiences the greatest amount of extreme precipitation? Is it along the coast, in the mountains, in the north, or it depends on how you calculate extreme precipitation? All right, some good questions here this evening, and I'll give everyone just a few more seconds to answer. It looks like most of you have gone ahead and already done so. So we'll close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, we'll go ahead and end the poll right there and share some results back to everybody. It looks like New Hampshire is the big winner this evening, the Granite State, about almost a third of you joining from New Hampshire, and good representation from everywhere within New England. Certainly with outside of New England as well. Thanks for joining, and even at least one person beyond myself joining from outside the country. So thanks so much for joining wherever you're joining from. And then on to our trivia questions. How do scientists quantify extreme precipitation? Overwhelmingly, 78% of you said all of the above. All right, we'll see about that. And then finally, where in the northeastern United States experiences the greatest amount of extreme precipitation? Well, almost half of you said it depends, and then a little bit split amongst the other answers there. So, all right, I'll go ahead and stop sharing the poll right there, and let's get right into it. At this time, I'd love to welcome tonight's speaker, Rob Nazarian. Rob, hey, you there? Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Here, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, I can hear you, I can see you, and I'd love to hand it right off. Thanks so much for joining, and thanks for offering your work tonight.
Perfect. All right, let me pull up the slides. Can everyone see this clearly? All good, Brian?
Yeah, looks great. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone for joining tonight. It's my pleasure to present some of the results from my research group at Fairfield University. And so tonight's talk is titled Future Changes in Extreme Precipitation over the Northeast US. And just to motivate tonight's talk, I'm showing you satellite imagery from GOES on the right-hand side. And so you can see clouds moving up the Northeast US, and with those clouds, precipitation. We'll get into exactly what extreme precipitation is. To that question that was just asked in the poll, how do we quantify extreme precipitation? And look towards future trends in extreme precip over the Northeast US. Throughout tonight, I'm going to introduce to you some really fantastic undergraduates that do research in my lab at Fairfield University that meaningfully contributed to this work. Among them are Jimmy and Carissa, as well as my colleague from Scripps, Professor Nick Lutzko. So what I'm presenting tonight are the full results or some partial results that a paper that we published in the Journal of Applied Meteorology and Climatology back in late 2022. I'd encourage you, if you're interested in tonight's results, to scan this QR code that will take you to the full paper where we go into much more detail than I have the time to present tonight. So that's if you're interested in this topic and would like to learn more. This is a bit of a full circle moment for me, I must admit, before I get started. I've been able to visit the Mount Washington Observatory and climb Mount Washington on several occasions. And so it's from this vantage point of being a hiker that I want to present and frame tonight's results. So not only how we should think about future trends in precipitation for infrastructure and planning, but how it's also going to impact recreation. So how will it impact skiing? How will it impact the hiking season? Those are all of the things that I hope to at least touch on tonight in the presentation. Mount Washington Observatory is a really fantastic resource, and I'm particularly very grateful to the observatory. I was actually able to tour it back in 2022. I climbed Mount Washington with some friends that summer, was able to tour the observatory. It's really cool, the work that they're doing, and for offering this monthly seminar series for learning more about science regarding the mountain in general. So why are we thinking about changes in extreme precipitation? And before we even talk about the Northeast, why extreme precipitation? Well, it's one of the biggest impacts, arguably, of a changing climate. What I'm showing here are a few newspaper snippets from the last year, really. The first is flooding in Maine and how it's really impacted hikers on the AT this summer, the Appalachian Trail. A number of hikers on the Appalachian Trail that were trying to complete a through hike had to stop and be rescued because of the extreme precipitation conditions over the summer. They were quite severe. There's also been an issue and some sort of feedback between the social side and the weather side. So between both impacts due to an excessive number of hikers and extreme weather leaving their mark on the mountains. So again, this notion of extreme weather and thinking about recreation and the White Mountains for recreation is something that is really motivating part of this work tonight. I just want to show a few snapshots over the past year. So when we talk about extreme precipitation, it's really impactful to frame this in terms of a few concrete events. What I'm showing here is a NASA image from Montpelier, Vermont. This is during the July 2023 floods, which were really devastating for Vermont. It led to significant damage, a number of injuries, and unfortunately loss of life. It was a tremendous impact on the state. This is an example of an extreme precipitation event and motivates our work, trying to characterize how these events will change, and importantly for tonight and what we're going to discuss, how the frequency of these events is projected to change in a warming climate. Just down the road from the base of Mount Washington is the village of Jackson, New Hampshire. This is an image taken from late last year, so December. There was really strong flooding that occurred. This flooding was due to strong rains on top of snow that had already fallen, which is prime for flooding conditions. This is the Ellis River that runs through the center of Jackson Village. And I'm actually going to pause for a second just to go to a video. This is courtesy of AccuWeather on Instagram. And this is the river. Anyone that knows Jackson Village knows that it's very calm, very peaceful. This is far from that, and the result of the excessive rainfall, the extreme precipitation, again, on top of that flooding. For wayfinding, right here, this is the Wentworth Hotel in the background, but you can see a number of landmarks in Jackson and the strong waters moving through the town. Really a lot of damage that was associated with this. So again, that's driving our questions tonight of changes in extreme precipitation and trying to project what it will look like over the Northeast through the end of the century. And again, throughout this presentation, using outdoor recreation, such as hiking and skiing, as kind of a touchstone of thinking about how these changes will impact those activities. Let's take a step back for a moment to look globally before we zoom into the Northeast United States. What I'm showing here are changes in precipitation from climate simulations. On the left, we're looking at changes in mean precipitation. So I would say that that's your average rainy day. And on the right, we're looking at changes in heavy or extreme precipitation. Anywhere on this plot that you see a green or blue color, that means that there is an increase. Anywhere that you see a brown or yellow color, that means that there is a decrease. Starting on the left-hand side, we see that in most regions, there's expected to be an increase in precipitation. And I would say here that regions that already experience a lot of precipitation are projected to get more, whereas regions that are already quite dry are projected to get less. Then looking to the right, where we're looking at heavy precipitation, across the board, there are some exceptions, but across the board, there seems to be an increase in extreme precipitation. And that increase is larger than what I'm calling your average rainy day. So this is globally. And what we now want to do is we want to zoom into the Northeast US. In order to do this, and in order to walk through this analysis, I want to just introduce a bit of theory about how precipitation should change. Physics tells us that your average rainy day should increase in magnitude by about 2% for every degree of warming. So if the Earth were to warm 1 degree, your average rainy day, you could expect to see 2% more precipitation. Again, this is just your normal day where you get some rainfall. It's not heavy by any means. In contrast to that, for your extreme precipitation, the physics tells us that your strongest storms are going to increase in magnitude by 7% for every degree of warming. So if we were to warm by 1 degree, the strongest storms would have 7% more precipitation associated with them. That 7% number comes in from a relationship in physics that says the atmosphere can hold 7% more water vapor for every degree that it warms. And so our strongest storms are when the atmosphere is letting go of releasing all of that water vapor to precipitation. And so this is the theory. But even though this is what physics tells us, that doesn't mean that this is necessarily what's going to happen over in the Northeast US. There can be some geographical dependence. And so that's what we're really analyzing in this study. And it's these two numbers to keep in mind as we're going forward. We would expect about 2% per degree warming increase in mean precipitation and about 7% increase for every degree of warming for extreme precipitation. There have been studies of the Northeast US, and I want to start with some observations. So scientists that have gone out and collected past observations or data of precipitation over the region. What I want you to look at is this thick red line on both the left-hand side and the right-hand side. This is showing the average over time. And what we can see if we look at the total precipitation on the left is that that precipitation has increased over time over the Northeast United States. On the right, we're looking at extreme precipitation. And likewise, we can see from observations from scientists going out into the field or crowdsourcing of data, we see that extreme precipitation has likewise increased over the historical period, at least over the past 60 or so years. So the question then exists, is this going to happen through the end of the century? And that's a lot of what we're looking at here. But already in the historical record, the Northeast United States has seen an increase in both the total amount of precipitation and the extreme precipitation. Other scientific groups, for instance, this study is from the University of Connecticut, have looked to see specifically over the Northeast how extreme precipitation will change. What I'd like you to do is direct your attention on the left to this blue box. This is looking at changes in precipitation over the Northeast specifically. Any of these bars that are above this horizontal line mean that there is an increase in extreme precipitation. And you could see, regardless of whichever metric you use, whether it's this top 5% of storms or days where you get more than 10 millimeters of rain, either way you look at it, it's projected to increase in looking at models. Furthermore, if we look at spatially over the region, again, this study by colleagues at the University of Connecticut, have shown that it's projected to increase over the entire Northeast United States. What you see here, however, is that there's very little detail to these projections. So you see some large swaths of area where the extreme precipitation is expected to increase, but we really wanted to look at higher resolution. We wanted to look more locally to see how extreme precipitation would change. And that's part of the work that we did in the study. So the questions that were driving the study are the following. So first and foremost, what are the projections for future extreme precipitation over the Northeast US? How do these trends vary over the seasons? So is there a particular season where we could expect to see a greater increase in extreme precipitation? Then what is causing this? So what are the physical processes that are causing this increase in extreme precipitation? And then finally, because we're looking into the future, we have to use climate models. And so a natural question to ask is, do these models agree? In the right, I'm showing photos of two really terrific undergraduate students that worked on this project. On the left, we have Chris Agostino. Chris graduated last year and is now working in research and development. And on the right is Jimmy, who likewise graduated last year and is working towards a PhD. And both of these students did a really terrific job, and their work will be presented among all of the results tonight. So in order to do this study, when we're looking into the future and trying to project changes in extreme precipitation, we need to use models. And so this visualization is a way to get some insight into what a climate model is. So we could take our globe and we could break our globe up into a number of grid boxes, as you see in this diagram to the left. In each of those grid boxes, we're doing a number of calculations, all of these equations that describe the physics of the atmosphere, the ocean, and the climate system. And we're doing these calculations repetitively over multiple days and over years in some cases for some of our long simulations. And so these calculations that we're doing, we have a number of variables that we get. We have precipitation, temperature, so on and so forth. And that's what we're analyzing. So what I want to just really stress here from our intro to climate modeling is that we are calculating specific equations. This is not statistical. We're not saying that there's a certain probability from these equations. They're giving us temperature and precipitation for any number of conditions that we're providing the model. And so that's how we do our modeling. And specifically throughout the study, we're looking at the Northeast US. So we're doing all of this modeling. We're splitting up the Northeast into these tiny grid boxes, and we're doing all of our physics calculations at each of those grid boxes. We're specifically using what's called NA-Cortex. This is a very fancy way of saying that we're using simulations that have a high resolution. That means we can have very small regions that we're looking at, and we could see when I'm showing those maps of extreme precipitation in just a moment, a good degree of granularity. We could see regionally variations in extreme precipitation that earlier studies couldn't see. We're using about 11 simulations in this study. I'll give more information on those in just a minute. But earlier studies have shown that using simulations that have this high resolution, that break up the region into a number of small grid boxes to do the calculations, really provides a quote unquote added value. That is, you're more precisely able to capture the physics that governs this extreme precipitation, and you're able to get more accurate projections. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at daily projections, which is one of the main ways that we quantify extreme precipitation. As I mentioned, we're looking at 11 very high resolution simulations. These simulations are being done with conducting these calculations every 25 kilometers, so pretty high resolution as far as climate models go. These models are being forced by human emissions of greenhouse gases, and for our simulations, we are assuming that through the end of the century, so through 2100, we are emitting a high level of greenhouse gases. Now, this doesn't necessarily match realistically what is being emitted when we compare this to globally averaged emissions. This is the norm in the climate community, and we have ways of kind of taking this out when we're looking at our results that I'll show in just a few minutes. But this is how our models are forced. So we're continuing to emit a high number of greenhouse gases. For our study, we're going to define two periods that we refer to as historical and projected. So whenever I say historical, that's using historical emissions of greenhouse gases from 1986 to 2005. And the projected period is the end of the century. So what we're going to be looking at is how through the 21st century, extreme precipitation is changing over the Northeast United States. I would just make a general comment here that the results we're seeing, because we're looking over this longer time period, tend to be driven by this forcing. So they're driven by the high emissions of greenhouse gases, of CO2. There is some internal variability, there's some natural variability to the climate system, but we're really not talking about that here because we're looking over this much longer time period with this high forcing of greenhouse gases. To the right, I'm listing off the simulations that we're using, which is not important for our purposes tonight. But what I would say is that we're not going to present tonight any single simulation that we're looking at. Rather, each of these simulations has some bias associated with it. So it's the norm in the field of climate science to average the results over all of these simulations. And in doing so, minimizing the bias. So only at the very end tonight will I show results from single simulations. Instead, we're using a number of models from a number of modeling centers, and we're averaging the results together so as to minimize bias when looking at our projections. Now, the question that was asked, I believe, second in the poll tonight is how do we calculate extreme precipitation? And we have a number of climate scientists and atmospheric scientists in the audience for sure, because you're right, there's multiple ways of calculating extreme precipitation. I want to walk you through the three main metrics that we use before I present our results. First, we could use RX one day, and that's a very fancy way of saying this is the annual maximum of daily precipitation. So this is the most precipitation you get in one day over the course of a year. The next metric we could use is our 10 millimeters. Again, a fancy acronym that gets at the number of days in a year where the precipitation exceeds 10 millimeters. So we just do a simple count. How many days throughout this calendar year is the precipitation greater than 10 millimeters? And that's how we could calculate extreme precipitation for that year. The other way that we could do it is through a percentile, and most common is the 99th percentile. This is basically saying, what's the top 1% of the rainy days that you have? So these are going to be the strong rainy days that are leading to flood-like conditions. I'm going to present results using all of these metrics in just a few minutes, but primarily we're going to be leaning on this R99. So this is, again, that top 1% of storms. These are the most stormy days, and we're looking at how those days are changing in a warming climate. Let's jump right into the results. And I want to look at, again, this top 1% of storms. On the left, I'm showing you that historical period, and on the right, I'm showing you the end of the 21st century. Notice here that on average, in both the historical and the projected sense, we get to the answer of question number two. Question number three, rather. Where do we get the most extreme precipitation? And the answer, at least based on this metric, is along the coast. So historically, we tend to get the greatest or the strongest storms along the coast. And if we look to our projections towards the end of the century, that still holds. So the increase in extreme precipitation, the whole region is experiencing an increase in extreme precipitation, and you still have that the coastal region is getting more extreme precipitation. I'll show you a plot of the change in just a moment. Here we're showing other ways of calculating extreme precipitation. So on the top is the max annual precipitation. Again, you can see that if we're looking at the max precipitation over 1 year that a region gets, it's largest along the coast than it is inland. Along the coast, some areas are seeing almost 100 millimeters of rain in 1 day, which is a significant amount. And our simulations suggest that that's expected to increase in a warming climate. And on the bottom here, I'm showing our 10 millimeters. So the number of days a region experiences 10 millimeters or more of precipitation. Notice here that this is in contrast to the other ways of calculating extreme precipitation that I showed. They show that there's the most extreme precipitation along the coast, but we don't see that here. Instead, this metric is picking up something else, and our friends in the White Mountains are seeing the White Mountains are lighting up here. These regions of purple here for the White Mountains and also for the Green Mountains as well in Vermont are experiencing many days with precipitation over 10 millimeters. So this metric in particular is really good if you want to look at mountainous regions. I would say that Appalachia is also lighting up as well for a region that's getting a lot of precipitation, extreme precipitation by this metric. And again, if you look to the right for what's projected at the end of the century, the regions that are already experiencing a lot of extreme precipitation are projected to get more. And so the difference here in these different measurements is what's causing the extreme precipitation. We know that mountains can get quite a bit of precipitation due to orography. So that is air lifting up above the mountains as it travels over. And so that's what we're really picking up by this metric at the bottom. Whereas the other metrics show more of a prevalence of extreme precipitation along the coast. What we're most interested in for all of this is the change. So what I'm showing you here is that projected minus the historical. So what we're looking at is how each of these metrics will change in a warming climate. Let's start with the 1% strongest storms, and that's what I'm showing on the left. In this case, we see that models are projecting the entire region to see an increase in the top 1% of storms. And I would say that it's relatively uniform over the region. Likewise, I could make the same case for the maximum annual precipitation on the top right. The whole region, if we measure extreme precipitation using this method, is projected to see an increase. The third metric, the number of days where the precipitation is greater than 10 millimeters, which is a lot of rain, the whole region is expected to see an increase. However, that increase is what I would quantify as moderate along the coast, and it's much stronger inland. So the increase in extreme precipitation, at least measured by this metric, would be greater in the northern part of the Northeast US. So regardless of the metric, all of the metrics are showing an increase in extreme precipitation. I'm going to really focus on the top 1% of storms, so R99 on the left. This is what most climate scientists use when they're predicting changes in extreme precipitation. But I just want to note the other two exist, and there's different physics that are causing those changes that we see. So what I want to do now is I want to take those 11 simulations that we had and think about how extreme precipitation changes, how mean precipitation changes, so your average rainy day, and how temperature changes. So walk me through the left graph with me. On the left, we're looking on the vertical axis at extreme precip, and on the horizontal axis, we're looking at temperature change, so how much the region is warming. So you can see that as the models get warmer, or as we go to simulations that have more warming, there's more extreme precipitation that occurs. And that agrees with the theory that I presented earlier. More warming, more extreme precipitation. Likewise, we could see that for more precipitation, a more extreme precipitation on the vertical axis on the right, there's more mean precipitation. So not only are the strongest storms getting worse, but we're also seeing an increase in your average rainy day, how much rain you're getting on your average rainy day. So all of the projections, again, are showing an increase in extreme. They're showing an increase in your average precipitation. And again, the warmer the atmosphere, the more of an increase you see. So more heating, you get more extreme precipitation, more mean precipitation or average precipitation. What I want to think about here is the change in frequency. And so this is arguably one of the most important results of our study. So I'm plotting on this blue line here how many days we have these types of precipitation in the historical simulations, and in red, it's in projected simulations. So if you follow my cursor on the left-hand side, we're looking at days for which there is no precipitation, so 0. On the left, we're seeing that in the future, simulations are suggesting that we will have more days with no precipitation. Let's jump to the right-hand side of this plot. On the right-hand side of this plot, we're looking at days for which there is extreme precipitation, greater than 10 millimeters. projections suggest that at the end of the century, again, this red line, there will be more days of extreme precipitation than in the historical period. That's in contrast to the middle of this graph, where the blue line is above the red line, which suggests that in the future, there will be fewer days of moderate precipitation. So to summarize this plot, this is showing that our simulations suggest there will be more days of extreme precipitation, but it could be extreme high or extreme low, that is zero precipitation, and fewer days of moderate precipitation. That is, there will be an increase in the amount of extreme precipitation that falls, but it will be more intermittent. So we will be getting that precipitation over a shorter period of time, which has a number of implications for infrastructure, for recreation, for planning. This is averaged over the whole Northeast US, but for our audience tonight, I want to look specifically inland, and I want to look at Burlington, Vermont. And so that's what I'm showing on the right, bottom right here. This is showing the same trend that we saw for the whole Northeast US, but it's exaggerated. So that is, we're seeing really for these high precipitation days where there's an extreme high precipitation that is increasing in a warming climate. So the frequency of high precipitation days is increasing. And so what we have here is a compound effect. The stormy days, the top 1% of the storms, on those days, we're getting more precipitation. In addition, the frequency of those days is projected to increase in a warming climate. So we have these two effects that are occurring that are important to separate in some sense. They're slightly different, but they both lead to an increase in extreme precipitation. So again, it's the magnitude of rainfall on any stormy day, as well as the increase in the frequency of quote unquote really stormy days. Let's now take this and let's think about it in terms of temperature. So what I'm showing you here is the projected change in temperature over the region, given high emissions of greenhouse gases through the end of the century. Notice here that there's a latitudinal variation in the temperature increase, where it gets larger as you go northward. That's well documented in the climate literature. It's a phenomenon called polar amplification. But if we were to really just average over this plot, we could say that on average, assuming high emissions of greenhouse gases into the future, the region would warm by about 4.5 degrees Celsius. And so what we did is we said, okay, let's take our results of how much precipitation is going to change, and let's divide them by this warming. Because then, if we don't warm 4 degrees, we could figure out how much precipitation would change accordingly. So we're normalizing our results to say, well, if we don't get that high increase in temperature, how could we expect our extreme precipitation to change? We also do this because whatever number we get for that calculation can actually give us some information about what's causing this. So what's the physics behind this? Related to this, we did this calculation where we looked at the change in frequency. That was a percentage, but we divided it by every degree that the region warms. And so again, we're getting at this understanding of, depending on how much we are warming, how would that change our projections? So what we're doing here is we're plotting different changes in frequency for different severity of storms. On the left, you've got your more moderate storms. On your right, you have your more intense, less frequent storms. So let's jump right to the right-hand side of the plot. I've highlighted this last data point. This is our 1 in 20-year storm, so it's a relatively infrequent storm. And what we're now going to do is we're going to read the left-hand side of this plot. So this data point is pretty close to 100. Let's just ballpark it as 100% per degree of warming. That suggests that the simulations are projecting for every degree of warming that the Northeast US experiences, the region could potentially see a doubling in the frequency of the strongest storms. So if we were to warm by 1 degree, that 1 in 20-year storm becomes a 1 in a 10-year storm, and on for each degree that you continue to warm past that. So again, we're taking our results of change in extreme precipitation and normalizing them by the change in temperature to have some foundation of how things will change if we don't warm as much as these high emission scenario simulations would suggest. We can also take these results and break it down into the seasonality. And so far, I've presented everything over the entire year. But as anyone knows, in the Northeast, our extreme precipitation is really variable. And in fact, what's causing our extreme precipitation differs over each of the seasons. In wintertime, we have a lot of nor'easters over the region, whereas in fall, a lot of this is coming from hurricanes or similar type storms. So let's take a look at the changes in extreme precipitation over the region. White colors or whiter here represents a lower increase, and green and purple indicate a higher increase in extreme precipitation. We've got winter, spring, summer, and fall, and immediately our eyes are drawn to the top two figures here. We see that overall, the greatest increase in extreme precipitation is during the winter and during the spring. Certainly, the summer is projected to see an increase in extreme precipitation. However, it's moderate compared to the other seasons. So a natural question then might be, well, if we're getting more extreme precipitation over the region in the winter, does that mean more snow? And that's something that I'm going to come back to at the end of this presentation. I know for our skiers in the audience, that's definitely a question that you might be asking. One other thing to note here is that for both the winter and the spring, that increase in extreme precipitation is primarily along the coast. So again, these coastal regions are experiencing the largest increase or projected to experience the largest increase in extreme precipitation. Now, let's figure out what's causing this change. And this is the only slide that has equations, and I'm just putting these equations here not because we're going to talk about them at all, but rather to show you how we do these calculations or the level of detail that is a part of these calculations. So we're going to look at the percent change in precipitation per degree of warming, because not only does that help us to calibrate if we have less warming than is projected in these simulations, but it also helps us to figure out what's causing this. Thermodynamics, that is the physics surrounding temperature and heat, tells us that for every degree the air warms, the extreme precipitation should increase by about 6 to 7%. However, that assumes that the atmosphere is static. And we know that it's not static. We know that the atmosphere moves. We have weather patterns. It's constantly evolving and moving. And so changes in the movement of the atmosphere, that is the dynamics, how the atmosphere flow in the atmosphere and how it moves, can also change this number for extreme precipitation. It could increase it or it could decrease it. And then we've got other effects that I'm just going to ignore altogether. So here's how we read these graphs. If we find that the change in precipitation is about 7% per degree of warming, that means that it's just the air holding more water and it's releasing that water to precipitation. If, however, the value we're seeing here is not 7% per degree of warming, that means that there is some dynamical change in the atmosphere. That is, the movement of the atmosphere is changing so that you either have more or less extreme precipitation than you would expect just from the change in temperature. What I'm showing here is the fractional change. I'll go back for a second. The fractional change over the entire year. If I were just to take this plot of the Northeast US and come up with an average, I would get about 3 to 4% per degree of warming. So definitely extreme precipitation is increasing, but it's not as much as I might expect from the fact that the atmosphere can hold more water because it's warmer. So that tells me that over the entire year, there's something changing about the dynamics of the system, atmospheric circulation perhaps, that's causing there to be less extreme precipitation than I might expect. There's definitely going to be an increase, and we've already established that. But there's something going on with the dynamics of the atmosphere causing it to be less than I would expect. If we start to look over the seasons, we see that winter and spring is close to that value that we would expect, 7% per degree of warming. So that leads us to believe that there's something changing with the dynamics during the summertime and the fall time, which is leading to less extreme precipitation than we would expect. We are not able to answer that question with the study, and that's one of the open questions that we're hoping to pursue in the future. But winter and spring, mostly it's a case of the atmosphere is warmer, it can hold more water, more extreme precipitation. During the summer and fall, something is going on with the dynamics of the system, causing there to be less than we would expect. And so that's what we're hoping to look at in a future study. Finally, I just want to say very briefly that there is good agreement between the simulations. Remember, all of the results that I've been showing tonight are the average over 11 simulations, and we've done this average to minimize the bias. If I take each of these simulations, which are shown to the left, and average over them to calculate what we would call the standard error, we find that the standard error is relatively low, and it's also not in a particular location. There's no geographical dependence here that we're doing better or worse in some regions. And so there's pretty good agreement between the models in all of these projections that we're looking at for the end of the century. Now, there are a lot of different pieces that I've given here that have kind of given us ideas for new projects or projects that we've been working on since this was published that I want to share briefly. And in the process, I really want to lift up all of the students at Fairfield that have made really tremendous impact on this work. Before I give you some overview of where we're going now, just to conclude and to highlight some of the big points that we've gone over tonight. Extreme precipitation, our projections have shown that it's expected to increase by about 5.7 millimeters. The magnitude of the increase is largest near the coast. And I would say that these future trends that we're seeing are consistent with the historical trend that I presented at the very beginning of this presentation when we were motivating this work. The second bullet point is really the takeaway message. If you're to leave tonight with one message, it's that our simulations suggest, or the simulations we analyzed suggest, that precipitation events are projected to be more intermittent, but more intense by the end of the century. Again, those events themselves will bring more precipitation, more extreme precipitation, but they're projected to be more intermittent, but more intense, which could have a number of human implications. The strongest storms are projected to increase in frequency by a factor of 4 to 5. So again, getting to that more intermittent, but more intense. The increase in extreme precipitation is relatively constant among the seasons. And the last point is that we're seeing a change that's about 2 to 5% per degree of warming and not what we're expecting from thermodynamics. So a natural question is why? What's the physics here that's causing this? So just to highlight some future work in the students that I'm working with, that first question of why are we not seeing a change in extreme precipitation based on the physics? So based on the fact that the atmosphere can hold more precipitation or more water vapor to then precipitate. This is a project that I'm working on with my collaborator, Professor Nick Lutzko at Scripps. And this is something that don't have anything to report yet, but it's one of the big questions that's come out of this study. And we're hoping to dive into this more over the next year. But again, what's causing this, particularly over the summertime, to have a lower increase in extreme precipitation than we would expect? The next project that I want to refer to is something that I alluded to earlier in the presentation and then throughout. So one of our results is that the region, particularly the White Mountains, could see a significant increase in wintertime extreme precipitation. So the natural question is, does that mean more snow or will it fall in its liquid form? And so these are two newspaper headlines that I just pulled from the past week. Regions that, as of December at least, usually get a lot of snow have more rain. So is it so warm that you're not getting snow, instead you're getting rain? That's what I'm pursuing right now with students Ethan Chow and Bertie Mativich. One of the preliminary plots we have here on the right is the change in timing between extreme snow events. And so we're looking at not only is there more extreme snow or less extreme snow, but how frequent are those events? What's the duration between those events so that you can have consistent snow for recreation and for skiing? So that's something that we're working on now that we hope to have some results on and publish in the next year. And finally, I want to just end here. A lot of what I'm showing is for the Northeast United States, but also it's important to remember that there are other regions that are acutely impacted by a warming climate. This is work that Brody, Carissa, Jimmy, and another student from Scripps, Noel, worked on with Nick and I over the last year. This was just published in the Journal of Climate. But we really felt that it was important to look at other regions that have not been studied as much as the Northeast United States. In this study, we looked at northern Mexico, which already has quite extensive droughts. And we looked at projections of extreme precipitation over the region. This result was really eye-opening. We saw, for instance, that the drought season is expected to be even drier. In the monsoonal season, the wet season is expected to be have even more extreme precipitation, which has a number of other implications. But our group has felt really strongly about certainly looking at our home in the Northeast, but also looking at other regions that haven't been explored as much, which also inevitably will be impacted by climate change in different and just as severe ways as the Northeast US. So thanks for joining in tonight. With that, I'd love to pause and take any questions that you have.
All right, thanks so much, Rob. I really appreciate that. That was excellent. Folks, as Rob mentioned, we'd love to take as many questions as we can. Just as a reminder, we already have some questions in on Zoom here. If you're joining through Zoom, you can take your questions through the Q&A button, and we'll just jump right into it, see how many we can get to. And for those we can't, certainly we welcome any follow-up questions here. Rob, the first question, right out the gate, some really excellent questions here. One from Jim, who's referring to some overturning circulation, basically ocean currents. So, I mean, I know you're looking at projections here, maybe assuming certain things within these models and how the state of the atmosphere is kind of operating now. But I mean, to what, in like your knowledge, I mean, if say major ocean patterns change, is this part of the modeling that takes place, and how, how that might potentially play into some of these scenarios that you look at?
Absolutely. So there's some subtleties of the particular circulation that's being referred to here. So this circulation is the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. So perhaps for tonight, I'll put those subtleties to the side. But the models we're using are what we call coupled models. So they include both the ocean and the atmosphere. And so climate models really bring these two together, and they are run or simulated in sync, essentially. And so changes to the ocean state can have changes to the overall climate and changes in extreme precipitation. So the change that's being referred to here by the circulation pattern is not simulated in these particular models, but they do include other changes due to the ocean, for instance. So we know, for instance, in the Northeast US that in the fall, we can have some hurricanes which make landfall. And, there's certainly many things that are conducive to hurricanes, but one of them are warm surface waters. And so certainly that depends upon the circulation pattern in the ocean. So yeah, that's part of this, and that definitely has an impact on extreme precipitation over the region. And I would say particularly during the fall season, when a lot of the extreme precipitation we experience over the Northeast is due to hurricanes. And I'd be happy to follow up offline about the subtleties of that particular example.
Appreciate that, Rob. Yeah, there's obviously, as you're alluding to, a lot that is coming into these models. And I mean, even there's some questions here from some of the initials. JB, who was asking a little bit about some information about avalanches or the data collected, in certain drainage areas or watersheds that where you might be getting measurements, or say like stream flow or river gauges. Kind of made me curious as well. Just, if I know you're kind of, in this case, is probably assimilating a lot of data and a lot of different climate stations and physical places that are providing this long-term climate data. But I mean, are there any I just wonder if, like, specifically, if you could maybe throw out some examples of like some of the data sets that you're using in terms of historical data, and like what those stations are kind of like, and what we know from the past, how is that helping us project the future, sort of stuff.
Absolutely. So in this particular study, we're only using climate models. So for the historical portion that we're talking about, those are simulations that were run using historical emissions of greenhouse gases. But other scientific groups have compared these simulations to observation. So for instance, rain gauge data or crowdsourced rain and temperature measurements, to show that these simulations at least for the historical period, can really accurately capture the physics and the extreme precipitation for the historical period before they're used to project into the end of the century. We didn't do that for the Northeast US since that's already been done by another group. But what we did for the Mexico project was we looked at both satellite data for the region as well as another data set, which was a blending of satellite data, some simulations, as well as some rain gauge data from the field. And again, we compared the historical simulations of the model with all of these observations, and the model performed remarkably well, which gave us faith in using the model for the future. I don't have those plots here. It's for that Mexico project, like I mentioned, but it's the same simulations. We had about, I think, 98% agreement between the observations and our simulations for the historical period, which gave us a high degree of confidence in using this to push projections to the end of the century. But there are any number of observations. I would say that satellite is becoming increasingly common because you can particularly get information from areas for which that are inaccessible or for which there's a low population density where you can't do that sort of crowdsourcing and rain gauge.
Yeah, absolutely. And snow on the ground and all those things, some of those citizen science projects that are out there that help kind of then hopefully ground truth some of that satellite data as well, which is great. All right. Well, I know you're a professor of physics, so now this could be an unfair question. Dr. Thomas Sorella wants to know, what's the projected ski conditions going to be for the next 5 years? Good luck with that one. What's it
All
going to
right.
be in the next 5 years?
So what we're looking at here are changes through the end of the century, and I want to stress that. On yearly timescales, the climate system can change naturally. And so the ski conditions perhaps would depend on those natural variations over short periods of time. So again, what we're looking at here is century length projections. Over short timescales, precipitation over the Northeast US is tied to the phase of ENSO. So ENSO stands for El Nino Southern Oscillation. And in the scientific media, we refer to El Nino or La Nina as the two different phases of ENSO. We're currently in an El Nino phase, which means more precipitation for the Northeast US, great for skiers, but warmer in the Northeast US, not so great for skiers. And so how we transition out of this El Nino phase into the next phase, whether it's a neutral phase for a while or we go right to a La Nina phase, that actually for the next couple of years has significant implications for skiing. So I don't mean to hedge on the answer to this question, but it really depends on our ENSO conditions. I would expect perhaps that conditions could improve in subsequent years as we move out of the El Nino. Short, perhaps less precipitation, but it's colder, which provides that snow rather than freezing rain or liquid precipitation, which is essential for skiing in the mountains.
Well, you did an excellent job mastering that. The answer to that one, hedging is what you must do, because I think even in this scenario, like you're mentioning, we have some smart folks at the observatory as well who've been posed that question. And it's an interesting thing where you say, well, plenty of precipitation, but warmer, but it will snow. It will absolutely snow, and those moments will come. And I guess what I'm hearing from you and from others is make the most of it when it's there. So you gotta be ready for when it comes. There's some other fantastic questions here as well, including one from, and apologies if I mispronounce your name, Casimir is asking, have climate models like the ones used in this study improved over the past decade? And if so, how much and why?
Great question. So I would say that maybe I would contextualize this a bit. Climate models have improved and climate models continue to improve. However, the climate models are particularly improving in their representation of small scale processes. So processes that occur over small spatial scales. If we go back decades in the scientific literature to the first climate model that was written by Dr. Suki Manabe, the estimate that Suki received from his simulation of the change in temperature actually is still right in the range of changes of temperature we see from modern climate models. So if you're thinking of temperature alone in this calculation of the global average change in temperature, our models have performed consistently in that regard. With time, they've included more and more physics, making them more and more complicated and more expensive to run on computers. And they've included other processes that we didn't have before. So now we've got not only the physics of the atmosphere and the ocean, but now we've got vegetation on land and the feedbacks between biological systems and physical systems. We've got biogeochemistry in the ocean, which is in the transfer of gases between the atmosphere and the ocean. So we've got all these processes, things we couldn't simulate before. And so you could argue that climate models are getting better because we're including all of these other processes. But if your goal at the end of the day is to think about how temperature is changing based on emissions of greenhouse gases, that answer has actually been pretty static over the past decades from the very first climate models. When you get to studies like this, where small scales matter, so for instance, these models are looking at boxes of 25 kilometers by 25 kilometers, it matters because some of the physics here for extreme precipitation happens on very small scales. One of the processes that we refer to is called convection, and convection happens over small scales. When we're talking about snow, you really want to have a great model with high resolution to capture that and to capture convection. If we're talking about other things like ocean circulation or global average temperature, I would say that models have been pretty consistent in their projections over the past several decades. They're always improving. There's always room for improvement, but it really depends on the scientific question that you're asking.
Well, just I know this, and not to skip over other people's questions, but Rob, I mean, the thing that you just sort of mentioned there that kind of sparked my interest for a second was this idea of convection as a means of maybe, I mean, right away I'm thinking about thunderstorms and the middle of summer and how isolated some of this extreme precipitation may be in some locations. And I don't know, I mean, part of me wonders, I'm sure you have some thoughts about that summer and the fall sort of lower amplitude change potentially on extreme precipitation. Does that have something to do with it? Some of that more localized or seasonal type of weather that we experience during those periods of time?
Absolutely. So before I even answer that, let me just kind of give an overview of the physics that's responsible for extreme precip during each of the seasons. So over the Northeast US, during the wintertime, most of our extreme precipitation comes from essentially nor'easters. So low pressure systems, we refer to them as nor'easters. In the springtime, most of the extreme precipitation over the Northeast US comes from fronts. So thunderstorms and the like. Summer, it's a lot of convection, and I'll refer to that more in just a second. And during the fall, we get a good amount of extreme precipitation in the Northeast from hurricanes. So in the scientific community, we refer to those as tropical cyclones. Now, each of those processes that corresponds to the extreme precipitation during each of the seasons is simulated to varying degrees in these simulations. But as you alluded to, Brian, arguably, climate models do not do a great job with convection. Of all of those physical processes, convection is the worst. And so I put the least weight on our results in the summertime throughout this presentation, not coincidentally, because in fact, if I were to make a bold statement, I would say that I have the least confidence in our results for the summertime over the Northeast US. It's standard in the literature to present it, but in our paper, we don't really focus extensively on it. And other research groups do the same, where they don't extensively focus on it. So convection, that is the rapid upward movement of air, which causes like rapid condensation and precipitation. It happens over such small scales that climate models can't really simulate it properly. And so that does lead to biases in calculations and in simulations of summertime extreme precipitation. So it's very rare for scientists to talk about specifically what's going on in the summer because there is that caveat. But again, that's basically each of the seasons and the physics, what's causing that extreme precipitation over the Northeast US.
Yeah, yeah, just makes me think about heavy rain in one side of town and not a drop in the other in summer. Some good questions here from Ken and Ted, and maybe just a couple more questions here for you, if you don't mind, Rob. One, I mean, you have to put borders and boundaries around your data somewhere in terms of what you're going to look at here. Ken was curious, hey, would your results be maybe better, or how would they change if you would include data from, say, like the eastern provinces of Canada? I'm sure you've probably wondered that. Or even Ted was curious about, like, hey, further south in the Appalachians, what do you think is probably happening there? So just kind of curious, yeah, along with them, where your data boundaries may have been.
That's a great question. Let me actually go to the Mexico project, because this region is also included in these simulations that we have. So these simulations cover the entirety of the continental United States, some of Canada, and some of Mexico. So that's kind of our domain for these simulations. We chose the states that we defined as the Northeast because that's the convention in the literature. That's how the literature defines the Northeast. But I would say as you make your window of what states you're considering bigger and bigger, then the processes that are responsible for causing that extreme precipitation can change. So if we were to look at the Southeast, for instance, the Southeast US, and the seasonality, what's causing the extreme precipitation during the different seasons, the physics there is different from the physics in the Northeast US. So they're seeing different drivers of extreme precipitation in different seasons. So we could continue to expand our window to include different states, different provinces in Canada. But I think that in the process, we wouldn't be able to say with as much certainty what's changing here. So that's part of the limitation. We wanted to be to have a significant region that we could say something meaningful, but we didn't want it to be too large so that we then had complicating processes of different physics that's causing this extreme precipitation. We wanted to have some certainty in the claims that we could make here. So that's kind of the balance that we were playing, and that's sometimes not so cut and dry. And so these questions are great. These are things that we were all thinking of when we were designing the study.
Awesome. Yeah, very, very interesting. And yeah, I'm sure you have to draw a line in the sand somewhere as well, drive yourself nuts. But all right. So Rob, if you don't mind, one last question here. It's a good one from Therese, who's asking, I'll just read it verbatim. Isn't the 7% per Celsius predicated on a similar rise in water temperatures? What water temperature increase is predicted? And I thought that was kind of an interesting question around ocean temperature, I guess, change over time.
That's a great question. So the 7% per degree of warming, I didn't use this terminology, but this is actually a relation in physics we call the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. And this is actually not related to the oceans in any way. So this relationship exists for just a parcel of air in the most general sense in a laboratory, or it could be in our Earth system in the atmosphere. So in general, a parcel of air can hold about 7% more water vapor for every degree that air warms. We say that it's for transparency, the saturation vapor pressure is increasing. So that's that 7% number. So if we assume then that our extreme precipitation events are events where all of it rains out, that means that the extreme precipitation events would increase in magnitude by 7% per degree of warming. So that relationship is actually just from theory. It's just in a lab setting. It's not predicated on the ocean or any ocean temperatures. But as you saw in tonight's presentation, our atmosphere is not the lab setting. So in different regions, you can get a value that's greater than or less than that 7% per degree of warming, driven by the dynamics of the system. So driven by changes in the movement of the atmosphere. And that's really interesting because that can give us some hints about what's going on and what's driving these changes. But I would say that that's a physics relationship just from the theory that's been used by a number of atmospheric and climate scientists. But it predates these sorts of studies.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Rob. Appreciate you taking that one on as well. Well, Rob, really so grateful for you giving your time this evening, sharing the work not only that you produce, but also your students and your department there at Fairfield University. Really grateful for you reaching out with the opportunity here to learn more about your work, and hope to actually it'd be great to have you back in the future here to learn more about what you're up to, because certainly a lot of interest in our corners as well. For everyone else joining this evening, thank you so much for joining. We're out of time tonight, but if you enjoyed tonight's free program, we would encourage you to make a donation to support programs like these over at mountwashington.org. You can hit the donate button that's in the upper right-hand corner of the website there. If you have thoughts for tonight's program, please feel free. We have a survey that follows the program here if you have any thoughts about future speakers as well, and an email following the program here tonight. And finally, don't forget to join us for an upcoming Science in the Mountains program. Our next 2 months here for Tuesday, March 12th, we'll have renowned storm chaser and extreme meteorologist Reed Timmer will join the program to discuss tornadoes. And finally, another special program this time will be at a special date and time, Thursday at 7 p.m., April 4th. We're going to join Mount Washington Observatory meteorologist Francis Tarasowitz and University of Maine astronomer Sean Latch, and they are going to be sharing a comprehensive look at the impending solar eclipse taking place just a few days later on April 8th. And they'll be providing a region-wide weather forecast for viewing this unforgettable astronomical event. So don't forget to register for those programs and watch any of the previous programs you might have missed over at mountwashington.org. I hope you all have a great night. Thanks so much, Rob. Really appreciate you again. Thanks everyone else for joining. Until next time, have a good night. Bye-bye.